The tribute clock on Ossuary Vault 9 read 4 hours 11 minutes when the empty patch of sky stopped being empty. Sub-Clerk Marin Sewell felt it before any instrument confirmed it. She was a colonist, not a soldier, born on the tribute moon of Hessel Drift, to parents who paid the levy every cycle and taught her to bow before she could walk. She kept the docking ledgers for the orbital way station, counting grain barges and ore skiffs as they lined up to surrender their share to the concordance of iron want. That was the whole of her world, numbers in, numbers out, and the tribute clock above the bay always counting down to the next collection. She had never once looked up at the sky and expected it to look back. But the void over the way station folded. There was no other word her language allowed. A circle of stars simply bent inward, as if the dark itself had been gripped and twisted, and out of that pucker of bent light came a shape so large her first instinct was to deny it. Her instruments denied it too. The mass reading climbed, then refused to display a number at all, then showed a string of error symbols her training had no name for. The thing was too big to be a ship. Ships had edges you could see all at once. This had a horizon. It warped in over Ossuary Vault 9, and Marin Sewell's jaw came open and stayed open, and somewhere below her 3,000 dockworkers stopped breathing in the same heartbeat. The concordance had ruled this arm of the spiral for 900 years. It ruled by the simplest law in the galaxy. It had more ships than anyone, and it kept them everywhere, and a world that did not pay the levy woke to find its sky black with collection cruisers. No one fought the iron want. Fighting was a category that had been removed from thought generations ago, the way a child stops reaching for fire after the first burn. You paid, you bowed, you counted yourself fortunate that the price was only your harvest and not your heir. Marin had counted herself fortunate for 31 years. The shape kept arriving. That was the part her mind could not file. A warp transit was a flash, a thing here then there. This vessel came through slowly, deliberately, the way a whale surfaces, more and more of it sliding out of the bent place in the dark, while the leading edge already darkened a quarter of the planet below. The way station sat at high anchor, and even from this distance the newcomer filled her viewport, then overfilled it, until she had to step back from the glass to take in the scale of what she was failing to take in. The hull was the color of cold slate, banded with long ridges that caught the system's pale star and threw it back in cool gray lines. There were no bright markings, no garish house colors, like the concordance painted on its cruisers to remind the tributaries who owned them. Just a single mark near what she took for the prow, a stylized open hand with the fingers spread, etched in a darker gray, large enough that she understood with a lurch that the mark alone was bigger than the entire way station she stood in. The station's collection officer, a concordance appointee named Overseer Drael Vant, came onto the deck at a dead run with his collar half-fastened. He was a tall, hard-eyed man of his species, all status and certainty, the kind who had spent his career standing in doorways and watching tributaries flinch. He looked at the viewport, and the certainty drained out of his face like water out of cracked clay. "Hail it," he said. His voice came out wrong. "Hail it now. Demand its registry. Nothing transits concordant space without a writ." The signals clerk tried. Marin watched his hands shake on the board. The hail went out, the standard challenge, the one that had cowed 10,000 merchant captains. "We are the concordance of iron want. Identify your vessel and your purpose, or be reduced." For a long moment, the colossal gray shape said nothing. It simply finished arriving. The last of its bulk cleared the warp pucker, and the bent stars snapped back to true, and the thing hung there complete, a single hull more than 40 kilometers from prow to stern, longer than the tallest mountain on Hessel Drift was tall, a made object so large it had its own gravity, its own weather of dust and light. Then it answered, and it did not answer the concordance. The reply came on every band at once, in the plain trade tongue every tributary in the arm could understand, pitched not as a challenge but as something almost gentle, almost tired, the voice of someone who had come a very long way. "This is the Deepkeeper vessel Long Patience, out of Earth, sailing under the open hand. We are not here for your registry. We are here for a debt." Marin Sewell did not know what Earth was. No one on the deck did. The word meant nothing in any concordance record, and that nothing was the most frightening thing she had ever heard, because the concordance had a file on everything that mattered, and this mattered more than anything she had witnessed in her life, and the file was blank. Overseer Vant found his voice. He drew himself up, that old reflex, the doorway posture, and he spat the only thing the Iron Wand had ever needed to say. "There is no debt the concordance owes. The concordance collects. It does not pay. Withdraw your vessel, or it will be added to the way." The long patience took its time. When it spoke again, the gentleness had not left, but something underneath it had shifted. The way the ground shifts before you understand it is shifting. "You misheard us, Overseer. We did not say a debt you owe to us. We said a debt. There is a moon 11 light-years from where you stand. Its name was Anvil Loom. 40 cycles ago your collection fleet found it could not pay, and rather than wait, your fleet snuffed its star to make an example of slow payers. 900,000 people lived on Anvil Loom. We were 3 days too far away to reach them in time." A silence on the deck. Marin felt it in her teeth. "We are not 3 days too far away anymore," the long patient said. "We have come to settle the account. Stand aside, and not one concordance life on this station will be touched. We have no quarrel with clerks and dock hands. Our quarrel is older and it is higher up, but understand us clearly, Overseer, because we will only say it once, and we have crossed a great deal of dark to say it. Today the collecting stops." Marin Sewell found that she had stopped breathing. She was a clerk. She had spent her whole life inside the machine of the levee, counting the harvests of frightened worlds into the holds of the Iron Want, and not once in 31 years had she heard a sentence like the one the gray ship had just spoken. The collecting stops. The words did not belong to any language she had been raised inside. In the concordance tongue there was no grammar for the collecting stopping, the way there was no grammar in her mother's prayers for the sun going out. It was a category error. It was the sky saying it was tired of being up. She looked at the open hand etched on the prow, kilometers wide, and she found her eye kept returning to it, because it was the strangest part of the strange thing. Every warship Marin had ever seen wore a fist, or a fang, or a grasping claw, the honest symbols of empires that took. The collection cruisers below her wore the gauntlet of the Iron Want, a closed gray hand crushing a star. And here was a vessel 40 kilometers long, plainly more powerful than anything in the arm, and it had chosen to mark itself with an open palm, the most defenseless shape a hand can make, the shape of a hand that is not reaching to take, and is not raised to strike, and Marin did not yet have the words for what that meant, but some animal part of her understood it before her mind did, and that part of her wanted, against 31 years of training, to trust it. How long, she wondered, do you wait for a debt before you cross a galaxy to collect it? The long patience had said 3 days too far. It had said 40 cycles. It had crossed the dark for 40 years carrying the weight of an arrival it had failed to make in time, and it had spent that whole 40 years, she would come to understand, not building a bigger fleet, but building a single ship patient enough to survive being too late and still show up. There was a kind of grief in the name, she realized. Long patience. It was not a boast about how long the ship could endure being shot at. It was a confession about how long it had endured being too late. Overseer Vant began to laugh. It was a thin, climbing laugh, the laugh of a man whose entire world rested on the certainty that no one fights, and who had just been handed proof that someone had crossed light years to fight, and could not make the two facts fit inside his skull. He keyed the emergency band. He called the home fleet. He called all of it. Marin Sewell stood at the glass, jaw still slack, staring up at 40 kilometers of patient gray iron, and understood with the cold, clean clarity of a falling stone that she was about to watch the only thing her people had ever believed in be proven false. Below them, the tribute clock kept counting down toward a collection that was never going to come. The home fleet came fast, because the concordance of Iron Want had built its entire 900 years on coming fast. Marin Sewell had seen collection fleets before, Twice in her life, the sky over Hessel Drift had filled with the gray and gold wedges of the iron want. Once when a neighboring district had been slow with its ore. Once when a captain had been made an example of for skimming the way. She remembered the way the light changed when 100 cruisers slid into orbit. The way the air seemed to thin. The way every adult she knew went quiet and small. That had been 100 ships. That had felt like the end of the world. What gathered now over Ossuary Vault 9 was not 100 ships. The muster bands lit Marin's board with arrival pings until the board stopped counting individual contacts and began counting them in blocks of 1,000. The Concordance kept a standing wall here, a garrison armada that guarded the tribute lanes of the entire arm, and it answered the emergency call all at once. Wedge after wedge dropped out of warp around the way station, gray hulls edged in collection gold, prow rams gleaming, until the stars themselves were crowded out and the void around the planet was a solid field of warships. 11,400. That was the final tally the board settled on. 11,400 cruisers of the Iron Want, the largest single muster the garrison had ever raised, summoned to face one ship. Overseer Vant had stopped laughing. He stood at the command rail with both hands gripping it, watching his armada assemble, and the certainty was flowing back into him with every fresh arrival. Marin watched it happen. She watched a frightened man become a confident one simply by counting, because counting was the only prayer the Iron Want had ever taught. 11,400 against 1. There was no number in any tributary's nightmare that survived odds like that. The math was the comfort. The math had always been the comfort. Now, Vant said softly, to the colossal gray shape that still hung unmoved at the center of his closing net. Now we will see what your debt is worth. He keyed the fleet-wide band, and his voice rang across 11,400 bridges, and across the deck of the way station, and into Marin Soul's bones. Vessel long patience. You are surrounded by the standing wall of the Iron Want. You have one chance to power down and be boarded, after which you will be weighed, broken, and distributed. Refuse, and you will be reduced where you sit. The Concordance does not negotiate with debts. The Concordance collects them. The long patience answered, and Marin noticed the gentleness was still there, and she did not understand how a thing that large, that surrounded, could still sound like the calmest object in the system. We want to be sure your captains hear us too, because in a moment some of them are going to have a decision to make, and we would like them to make it with open eyes. So listen, all 11,400 of you. We are a single vessel. You have counted us. You are right about the count. You are wrong about what the count means. The Concordance has spent 9 centuries teaching the galaxy that more ships is the same as more power. We have come a long way to teach you the difference, and we would very much rather teach it with words. So here are the words. Open your lanes. Let your tributaries go home unweighed this cycle, and take your wall back to your home stars, and we will all of us live to be old. That is the whole of the offer. It will not be repeated. The fleet-wide band erupted in something Marin had never heard from the Iron Want. Laughter. Not one man's thin climbing laugh, but 11,400 crews laughing at once. A roar of contempt that washed over the channel and made the signals clerk wince and pull his earpiece. They laughed because they had counted, and the count was the comfort, and the count said this was the easiest collection in the history of the Concordance. Reduce it, said Overseer Vant. The order went out, and the leading edge of the wall fired. Marin had never seen Concordance guns loosed in anger. Tributaries only ever saw them aimed. Now the forward 10,000 cruisers opened up together, lance fire and rail shot, and the heavy ram charges that could crack a colony dome, all of it converging on a single gray hull, and for one full second, the long patience disappeared inside a sphere of fire so bright that the way station's viewport dimmed itself to keep from blinding the deck. The deck cheered. Even the dock workers cheered, the reflex of a people who had learned that cheering for the collector was safer than the alternative. Marin did not cheer. She watched the fireball, and she found that she was not relieved. She was grieving a thing she had no name for, that had come across the dark to say the collecting stops, and had been answered with the only language the Iron Want knew. Then the fire cleared, and the long patience was still there, and it had not moved, and it did not have a mark on it. The cheering on the deck stopped, as if cut with a blade. Marin's board told the story before her eyes could believe it. The lance fire had struck something 100 meters off the gray hull and simply stopped, scattering into harmless light against a shell of bent space the instruments could not measure, a kind of standing wall of the vessel's own, invisible until something tried to cross it. 10,000 of the Concordance's heaviest guns had fired their hearts out at a single ship, and not one shot had touched the iron. "Again," Vance said, and his voice had a crack in it now. "All of you, again." They fired again. They fired for 11 minutes by the tribute clock, every cruiser in the wall, cycling their guns until the charge coils glowed and the recoil drift began to scatter the formation. 11 minutes of the heaviest sustained fire the garrison had ever produced poured onto one hull, and the long patience hung at the center of it, patient, unmoved, untouched, and let them. That was the part that broke something in the watching crews. Not that the great gray ship was winning. It was not winning because it was not fighting. It was simply standing in the open and absorbing the absolute worst the iron want could do, the way an adult stands in the rain a child is throwing, and waiting, with terrible courtesy, for the tantrum to exhaust itself. When the guns finally guttered out, the long patience spoke once more, and now even the gentleness had a weight to it that pressed Marin back from the glass. "You have had your turn," it said. "We told you the offer would not be repeated, and it will not. But we are not the Concordance. We do not collect what we are owed all at once. We will take it slowly and in order, and we will give every one of you the time to choose to be somewhere else. Watch carefully. The first to learn this lesson will be the ones who built the engine that snuffed the star of Anvil Loom. We know which ships those are. We have known the whole time." A section of the wall, far to Marin's left, lit up on her board with a marker she did not recognize, a soft amber outline that the long patience was somehow painting onto her own instruments across the void. 41 cruisers, clustered together, the old star-snuffing squadron, the ones whose hulls still carried the signature of the weapon that had killed 900,000 people 40 cycles ago. They had grown comfortable. They had been the proud ones, the example makers. They were the ones laughing loudest a moment before. The long patience moved for the first time. It did not lunge. A thing 40 kilometers long does not lunge. It rotated, with a slow majesty that was worse than speed, bringing one flank to bear, and along that flank a single line opened, a seam in the gray iron that ran for kilometers, and from the seam came a light that was not like the Concordance's guns at all. The Concordance fired in flashes, in violent stutters, the visual language of a culture that smashed things. The long patience fired in one long, continuous, unhurried beam, the color of a winter dawn, that crossed the gap to the 41 amber-marked cruisers and held. It did not detonate them. Marin had braced for an explosion, for the bright, ugly bloom she had seen the iron want make of slow payers' supply depots. There was no bloom. The beam simply touched the 41 star snuffers, one sweep, 11 seconds, and where it passed the cruisers came apart along their seams, unmade rather than blown, their hulls peeling open and going dark and cold and still, every system in them quieting at once, the way a hand closes a book. 41 ships, 11 seconds, no debris field, no fire, no screaming bands, just 41 warships that had been there and then were husks, drifting, dark, settled into the stillness of objects that would never move again. The fleet-wide band, which had been roaring with laughter 11 minutes ago, made a sound Marin Sewell would hear for the rest of her life. It was the sound of 11,000 crews understanding, all at once, that the count had never been the comfort, that they had brought a number to a place where number did not apply. Overseer Vance stood frozen at the rail. "It chose them," Marin heard herself whisper. She had not meant to speak. It went through all 11,000, and it chose the 41. It knew exactly which ones. "Silence," Vance said, but there was no force in it. The long patience let the stillness hold for a moment, the 41 husks turning slowly in the dark, and then it spoke again, and Marin realized the dreadful thing about its voice was that it had not changed at all. It had not gloated, it had not risen, it carried exactly the same patient gentleness it had used to make its offer, and that sameness was a horror all its own, because it meant the great gray ship felt no triumph in this. It felt only the long arithmetic of a debt being paid down, one line at a time. That was the squadron that snuffed the star of Anvil Loom, it said. They are settled now. We feel no joy in it. We want you to understand that, because the Concordance has taught this arm for 900 years that strength is the same as cruelty, and we are about to spend some hours teaching you otherwise. We could have ended your entire wall in the time it took you to laugh at us. We are not going to. We are going to take the debt slowly, by name, by deed, and at every step we are going to leave the door open for the rest of you to go home. The first door is open now. Any ship that breaks formation and warps for its home stars will not be pursued and will not be touched. We will count that as a debt forgiven. Choose. For a long, suspended moment, the wall did not move. Marin watched 11,000 cruisers hang in the void, and she watched the war inside them, the war between 900 years of certainty and 11 seconds of impossible proof, and she found that she was holding her breath, and that the whole deck around her was holding its breath. 3,000 tributaries hoping with a hope none of them dared show their overseer that some of those ships would take the door. Then, far out on the edge of the formation, a single cruiser broke and ran. It happened so suddenly that the board chimed before Marin saw it. One gray wedge peeled out of the wall, lit its warp coils, and was gone, fled for the home stars, the first ship in 900 years of the Iron Want to choose flight over collection. And the Long Patience, true to its terrible word, did nothing. It let the runner go. It did not so much as turn a gun. That was when Overseer Vance's last certainty cracked all the way through. "Hold formation," he screamed onto the fleet-wide band. "Hold formation. Any captain who breaks the wall will be reduced by his own neighbors. The Concordance does not flee. The Concordance does not flee." But the seal was broken now, and the watching crews had seen two things in 2 minutes that their whole culture insisted could not happen. They had seen the count fail, and they had seen flight go unpunished. And on the edges of the formation, one by one, then in 2s and 3s, more cruisers began to peel away and run for the dark. Marin Sewell stood at the glass with her jaw slack for the second time in 1 hour, watching the unbreakable wall of the Iron Want begin, ship by ship, to come apart, and watching the colossal gray vessel at the center of it let every runner go free, and she understood that she was not witnessing a battle at all. She was witnessing a debt being collected by something that had decided, on purpose, to be nothing like the collectors. Not every captain ran. That was the part that surprised Marin most, watching her board. Some of the wall held position, and not out of loyalty, she came to understand, but out of a kind of fury, the fury of men who had spent their lives believing they were the strongest thing in the dark and could not endure the proof that they were not. A formation of 900 cruisers in the middle of the wall locked their guns and refused to break, and one of their captains opened a band to the Long Patience, and his voice came across loud and shaking with a rage Marin recognized as the rage of the deeply afraid. "You think you have won something," he said. "You have unmade 41 ships and frightened cowards into running. We are the Iron Want. We do not run. We will sit here and fire on you until our coils burn out and our hulls go cold, and we will die at our posts, and that will be the answer the Concordance gives you. We will not be taught." And the Long Patience answered him, and the gentleness in it was so complete that Marin felt it like a hand laid flat against her chest. "Then do not be taught," it said. "We did not come to make you learn. We came to give you the room to choose, and you have chosen, and we will honor it. You want to fire on us until your coils burn out. We will let you. We will not unmake you for it. We do not unmake the brave, even when the brave are wrong, because the day we start doing that is the day we become the thing we cross the galaxy to answer. So fire. We will stand here. And when your coils have burned out and your hulls have gone cold, and you have spent everything you have, and we are still here, and still gentle, you will have to decide what to do with the man you have just discovered you are. That is the only weapon we will ever use on you. We will outlast your worst, and then we will still be kind, and you will have to live inside what that means. The 900 cruisers fired. They fired for a long time. Marin watched the charge readings climb and burn and gutter, watched the proud formation pour its whole heart into the gray hull, watched it accomplish nothing, exactly nothing, not a mark, not a scratch, not a flicker on the standing wall of bent space. And she watched the rage on the captain's band curdle slowly into something else, because there is nothing in the galaxy that humbles a cruel man like being forgiven while he is trying his hardest to kill you. When the 900 cruisers' coils finally burned out, the band went silent, and the formation hung there, spent, and the long patience did not say a single word of triumph. It simply waited, the way it had waited for everything, and let the silence do the teaching the guns could not. Far below, on the tribute world the wall had been summoned to protect, 1 billion people were watching the same sky Marin watched. The Concordance broadcast everything, always, to keep the tributaries afraid, and so 1 billion souls saw their master's guns burn out against the patient gray ship and accomplish nothing, and Marin would learn, years later, that something changed in that billion that afternoon, something the Iron Want could never undo, because you cannot make a people fear a wall again once they have watched the wall fire its whole heart at the open sky, and the sky simply stay. Then the board chimed with a new arrival, and Marin's stomach dropped, because she thought it was reinforcements, more wall, another garrison answering the emergency call. It was not. It was a single civilian hauler, a battered tributary grain barge, the kind Marin counted every day, and it had warped into the middle of the most one-sided battle in the history of the Arm by sheer terrible accident. An ordinary captain on an ordinary run who had no idea what he was dropping into. The barge appeared directly between the spent 900 cruiser formation and the long Patience, helpless, slow, a soft-hulled thing full of grain, and a crew of 9, exactly the kind of life the Iron Want had spent 900 years grinding under its heel. And the spent formation, in its rage and its humiliation, did the thing that cruel men do when they have been denied every other target. One of the 900 cruisers, coils not quite burned out, swung its last live gun toward the helpless barge, to take something, anything, to make some life pay for the day. The long Patience moved before Marin's eye could even find the threat on her board. The Winter Dawn beam did not fire on the cruiser. The keeper extended its standing wall again, that invisible shell, and wrapped it around the little barge entire, a bubble of bent space closing over a soft gray hauler, full of frightened grain haulers, and the cruiser's last shot struck the bubble and scattered into harmless light, and the barge sat inside the keeper's protection untouched, its crew of 9 never even understanding what had almost happened to them. The long Patience had reached across the whole width of a battle to put its own body between a cruelty and 9 ordinary lives, and it had done it without firing a shot, and it had done it in the time it takes to flinch. That, the long Patience said, and for the first and only time Marin heard something in its voice that was not patient, something sharp and cold and very old, is the line, "You may fire on us all you like. You may die at your posts, if dying is what you have chosen. But you will not, while we are here, put your guns on the helpless to soothe your pride. We have seen that before. We crossed the galaxy because of that before. 9 ordinary people in a grain barge are exactly who Anvil Loom was. We were 3 days too late for them. We are not 3 seconds too late for these. Lower your gun." The cruiser lowered its gun. Marin Sewell watched a single human ship, surrounded by the broken remnant of the largest armada the Arm had ever raised, calmly shield 9 strangers it had never met, and she felt the last of her old world go out of her like a held breath finally released. She had been taught her whole life that power was the thing that takes. She was watching, in real time, a definition of power so different that it had no word in the Concordance tongue. Power was the thing that stands in front. Power was the thing that shows up. Power was the open hand on the prow, and she finally understood what an open hand was. It was the opposite of a fist. It was a hand that could close and chose, every single time, not to. The barge, released from the bubble, fled for the deep on its terrified little coils, and its crew of 9 carried home the only eyewitness account of the day's first hours. And Marin heard, years later, that they told it in every port they touched, and that the telling of it did more to break the iron want than any beam ever could, because 1 billion people will fear a fleet, but they will follow a story. Overseer Drael Vant did the thing that men like him always did when the world stopped obeying them. He reached past the world for a bigger hand. He called the Iron Sovereign. Marin Sool did not, at first, understand what he had done, because the name was not one tributaries were permitted to know. She only saw him bend over the command rail and key a code sequence she had never seen used, a long string into a private band, and then she saw the way the other concordance officers on the deck went pale and stepped back from him, as if he had opened a door that should have stayed shut. The Iron Sovereign was the heart of the concordance, the central will, the thing the whole 900 years of collecting served. It did not come to way stations. It did not come to anything. The galaxy came to it. Vant had just told it that one ship had begun unmaking its standing wall, and now the heart of the Iron Want was coming to Ossuary Vault 9 in person. It arrived from the deep, and it did not warp in gently the way the Long Patience had. It tore in, a violence of bent space that flung the fleeing cruiser's warp tracks into chaos, and where it emerged the void itself seemed to recoil. The Iron Sovereign was a fortress more than a ship, a vast jagged construction of gray and gold the size of a small moon, bristling with the heaviest weapons the Concordance had ever forged, a hull built across centuries by every conquered shipwright the Empire had ever pressed into service. It was the single most powerful object the Iron Want possessed, and it had never once been used, because no one had ever made the Concordance afraid enough to use it. Marin's board could not even hold both vessels in one frame. The Iron Sovereign was larger than the Long Patience. That was the detail that put a thread of cold hope into every Concordance heart on the deck. Their fortress was bigger. The count had failed them, but here at last was something the gray ship could not simply absorb. A hull more massive, more armed, more ancient in its cruelty than anything in the arm. The Iron Sovereign spoke, and it did not bother with the trade tongue. It spoke in the high tongue of the Concordance, the language of command, and even tributaries who did not know the words felt the weight of them land like a struck bell. But it routed a translation across the bands because it wanted the watching arm to understand exactly what it was, and the translation came through cold and enormous. I am the Iron Sovereign. I am the will that has weighed 900 years of worlds. I have never been moved from my seat, and I have come now only because a thing too small to matter has presumed to teach my children disobedience. Vessel of Earth, you have unmade 41 of my cruisers and frightened a wall into running. You have done this because I was not present. I am present now. Power down, and I will make your ending swift. Resist, and I will spend 1,000 years finding the world that sent you, and I will snuff its star as I snuffed Anvil Loom, slowly, while its people watch. The threat hung in the void. And the Long Patience, the colossal gray deep keeper out of Earth, was quiet for a moment, and when it answered, Marin Sool heard something enter its voice that had not been there through all the firing and the unmaking. Not fear, the opposite of fear. A kind of recognition, the way a tired traveler recognizes the last hard hill before home. There you are, the Long Patience said. We have been hoping you would come yourself. We did not want to settle this debt with your cruisers. They only ever fired the weapon. You are the one who gave the order. 40 cycles ago, when Anvil Loom could not pay, a single will decided that 900,000 lives were worth less than an example. That will is you. We crossed a very great deal of dark to stand in front of that will and say one thing to it. We brought 11,400 of your children here as witnesses, and we let most of them run, because they were never the debt. You are the debt. You have always been the debt. The Iron Sovereign fired. It fired everything. Where the standing wall had loosed flashes, the fortress loosed an avalanche, A torrent of lance and rail and ram charge and weapons Marin had no names for, drawn from the captured arsenals of 1,000 conquered worlds, all of it converging on the gray hull at once. The viewport blacked itself out entirely. The way station shook from the bow wave of energy crossing the void. For 9 full seconds the long patience vanished inside a storm of fire, so total that the planet below was lit as if by a second sun. The storm ended. The long patience was there. It had not moved. It did not have a mark on it. The Iron Sovereign fired again, longer, and Marin understood that it was no longer trying to win so much as trying to make the impossible thing in front of it stop being impossible by sheer ferocity. It fired for 2 minutes, 3, 4, every gun in the fortress, the accumulated armament of 9 centuries of conquest, poured onto one patient gray hull. And the long patience stood in the open and let it, exactly as it had let the wall. And Marin realized she was watching the Iron Want spend the entire violence of its history against a thing that had simply decided to refuse it. When the Iron Sovereign's guns finally faltered, overheated, the long patience spoke into the smoking quiet. "Are you finished?" it asked. And it was not a taunt. It was a real question, gentle, almost kind, the question a physician asks a thrashing patient. "We need you to be finished. Because what comes next, we would rather you faced still." 900,000 people on Anvil Loom did not get to be still. You did not give them 9 seconds, let alone 9 minutes. You snuffed their star while they begged. We have all of that on record. We carry the names. Every one of the 900,000. We are going to read some of them to you now, because you have spent 9 centuries making the galaxy believe that the Wade do not have names, that they are only tribute, only number, only example. We are here to disagree. And the long patience began to read. Marin Sewell would never be able to describe, afterward, what it was like to hear a 40-kilometer warship out of an empire no one had ever heard of recite the names of the murdered dead of Anvil Loom across every band in the arm, slowly, clearly, one after another, while the Iron Sovereign hung in the void with its guns gone cold, and could not make it stop. The names were not in the concordance tongue. They were in the soft, round language of a snuffed moon, names of farmers and weavers and clerks, like Marin herself, children's names, the names of a people whose only crime had been a bad harvest in a cycle when the levy came due. The reading filled the bands. It crowded out the command channels. The fleeing cruisers, far out in the dark, heard it. The watching tributaries on 100 way stations heard it. The arm heard the names of the people the Iron Want had erased to make a point, and the Iron Want could not silence them. The Iron Sovereign tried. It fired its bands back, flooded the channels with its high command tongue, tried to drown the reading in noise. The long patience simply spoke through it, louder, calmer, name after name after name, and the noise of the fortress broke against the patience of the keeper the way the wall's fire had broken against its hull. "You cannot weigh a name," the long patience said, "between one set of names and the next. That is the thing your 900 years never learned. You can take a harvest, you can break a hull, you can even snuff a star. But the name goes on being a name, and as long as one ship in the galaxy is willing to carry it and say it aloud, the person it belonged to is not erased. We are that ship. We were built to be that ship. Earth lost more worlds than you will ever conquer, long ago, to things far worse than you, and we learned the only weapon that the cruel cannot answer. We learned how to remember out loud. We have been remembering Anvil Loom for 40 cycles. We are not going to stop because you are firing at us." Overseer Vant had sunk against the rail. He was not giving orders anymore. He was listening to the names like everyone else, his certainty gone past cracking into something Marin recognized, because she had felt it her whole life and had never once seen it on a concordance face. He looked, for the first time, like a person who had understood that he was on the wrong side of something true. The Iron Sovereign had one card it had not yet played, and it played it now, because a will that has only ever known force will always reach for more force before it reaches for anything else. Marin's board lit with a fresh muster, a second wall, warping in from the deep behind the fortress, ships the garrison had never known existed. They were the sovereign's own reserve, the private armada the heart of the concordance kept hidden against the day. A tributary somehow forgot to be afraid. Hulls darker than the collection cruisers, heavier, built without the gold trim because they were never meant to be seen by tributaries who would still be alive afterward. 6,000 of them dropped out of warp in a tight murdering shell around the Long Patience. Point blank, closer than the wall had dared to come, every gun already aimed. "You think you have humbled me with names," the Iron Sovereign said, and its cold, enormous voice had gone past rage into something brittle. "These are my hidden hand. They have never been seen because nothing has ever required them. They will fire from a distance at which even your sorcerer's shell cannot scatter all of it. I will bury you in the dark you came out of." And the 6,000 fired at point-blank range, all at once, the closest and heaviest fire any ship in the galaxy had ever been made to endure, a sphere of pure killing energy collapsing inward onto 40 kilometers of gray iron from every direction at the same instant. The Long Patience let them. It did not extend its shell wider. It did not dodge. It pulled the standing wall in close against its own hull, tight as a second skin, and it took 6,000 point-blank guns, the way it had taken 11,000 at distance, and the difference was only that the light was brighter, and the shaking was harder, and the viewport stayed black for longer. When the fire guttered out, because all fire guttered out against the Keeper eventually, the Long Patience was there, and it had not moved, and it did not have a mark on it, and the 6,000 hidden ships hung around it, in their tight murdering shell, having accomplished precisely what the wall had accomplished, which was nothing. "Your hidden hand," the Long Patience said gently, into the ringing silence, "is 6,000 more children you taught to do this. We see them. We have already chosen not to unmake them, the same as the others, because they too were handed a weapon and a lie. But we want you to understand what you have just done, Sovereign. You reached into your last secret and spent it, the thing you saved for 900 years, against the day a world stopped being afraid, and a world is watching you spend it right now and not be afraid. You have shown the whole arm the bottom of your strength. There is nothing under it. The hidden hand was the last card, and it was the same card. It was always going to be the same card. That is the secret at the heart of every empire built on force. The bottom is always just more force, and force is the one thing that has never, not once, been able to touch us." The 6,000 hidden ships, who had been told their whole service that they were the final answer, the thing no power could withstand, sat in their shell and understood that they had just fired the final answer, and the final answer had failed, and a silence went through them on the bands that Marin could feel from the way station, the specific silence of soldiers learning that the thing they were is not the thing they believed. The Iron Sovereign tried one more thing before it reached for the snuffer, and this one Marin felt in her own skull rather than saw on her board. The fortress had a second weapon, one the tributaries had never been told about because it was not used on ships, it was used on mines. The Concordance had learned, somewhere in its 900 years, how to broadcast fear itself, a pressure wave on a band below hearing that reached past the ears and into the oldest part of the brain and filled it with a certainty of doom, the cold animal knowledge that you were already dead, that resistance was meaningless, that the only mercy left was to lie down. It was how the iron want had broken the spirit of worlds that the guns alone could not. Marin felt it hit the way station like a tide, and 3,000 dock workers around her sagged where they stood, and her own knees buckled, and a voice that was not a voice told her in the marrow of her bones that there was no point, that the gray ship was a dream, that she should kneel. The Long Patience did not kneel. That was the thing the fear wave could not account for, because it had only ever been used on the afraid, and the Keeper out of Earth was not afraid. The wave broke over the gray hull and found nothing in it to grip, no old animal terror, no buried certainty of doom, only a calm so deep and so deliberate that the fear simply slid off it like water off slate. And then the Long Patience did something with the wave that Marin felt as a sudden blessed lifting, the pressure in her skull releasing all at once. It had caught the fear broadcast, the way it caught everything, and instead of merely refusing it, it turned it. It took the Concordance's own weapon, the pressure wave of doom, and it bent the standing wall around it and sent it back, not amplified, not as a weapon, but cleansed, stripped of the doom, and carrying instead the only thing the Keeper had ever broadcast, which was the names of Anvil Loom, threaded now into the band below hearing, so that they reached past the ears and into the oldest part of the brain of every Concordance crew in the system. And 6,000 hidden soldiers, and a gutted fortress, and a scattered wall all felt, in the marrow of their bones, in the place where the iron want had taught them to feel doom, the names of the 900,000 people they had been built to forget. Not as an attack, as a knowing. The Keeper had reached into the deepest part of them and written the truth where the fear used to live, and there is no shield in the galaxy against being made, for one moment, to know. Marin saw a hardened Concordance gunner 3 stations down begin to weep without understanding why. She understood why. The Keeper had stopped fighting the Empire's mind and started healing it, one name at a time, against its will, and that was a kind of power the Iron Want had no defense against at all, because you cannot armor a soul against being told the truth about what it has done. The Iron Sovereign, vast and ancient and out of answers, did the only thing left to a will that had never in 900 years been told no. It charged its star snuffer. Marin's board lit with the same signature the 41 husks had carried, the weapon that had killed Anvil Loom, now spun up inside the largest hull the Concordance possessed and aimed, not at the Long Patience, but down, at the planet below the way station, at the tribute world and its billion souls, the Iron Sovereign's last argument, the threat that had cowed the galaxy for centuries. Snuff a star, kill a world, prove that the count still meant something. The Long Patience stopped reading names. No, it said, one word. And for the first time since it had warped in, the gentleness was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was not rage, it was something far older and far steadier, the flat refusal of a thing that had crossed light years specifically so, this exact moment could not happen. That door, the Long Patience said, is closed. The star snuffer inside the Iron Sovereign reached full charge, and the weapon that had murdered a moon swung toward the planet below, and Marin Sewell watched the end of her world begin. She had 1 billion neighbors on the tribute world under her feet. She did not know them, she had never set foot there, but she knew exactly what was coming, because the Iron Want had taught its tributaries since childhood what the snuffer did, had shown them the recordings of slow-payer worlds going dark, had made the threat the floor everyone stood on. A snuffed star did not explode, it collapsed. It pulled its own light inward and went cold, and the world that circled it froze in a single afternoon, and everyone on it died slowly in the dark, with plenty of time to understand. That was the Concordance's masterpiece. That was why no one fought. The snuffer was the reason the Count had always been the comfort, and now the Iron Sovereign, beaten in every way that mattered but still holding the one card the galaxy had always folded to, was going to spend that card on 1 billion people simply to prove it still had it to spend. The Long Patience moved faster than anything that large had any right to move. It did not fire. That was the thing Marin could never afterward make people understand. In the single second it had, the colossal Grey Keeper did not loose its winter dawn beam at the fortress, because a beam would have shattered the Iron Sovereign and let the charged snuffer discharge wild, straight into the planet, and the Keeper had crossed too much dark to let the world die by accident in the saving of it. Instead, the Long Patience interposed. 40 kilometers of cold gray iron slid between the Iron Sovereign and the planet, and the standing wall of bent space that ringed the Keeper, the invisible shell that had scattered 11,000 guns to harmless light, expanded. It bloomed outward, the way Marin had once seen a deep-sea creature unfold a mantle to swallow something whole, and it closed around the front of the Iron Sovereign, around the very port where the snuffer was about to fire, and it held. The snuffer fired into it. The whole system flared. The weapon that had killed Anvil Loom discharged at point-blank range into the Keeper's standing wall, and Marin's board screamed every warning it had at once, and the viewport, even blacked out, lit her face white through her closed eyelids. The bent space shell took the full discharge of the Concordance's masterpiece, the weapon designed to kill a star, and it bowed, and it rippled, and it strained, and it did not break. It held the snuff inside itself like a fist closing around a coal. When the flare died and the viewport cleared, the Iron Sovereign's forward third was simply gone, not blown off but unmade, peeled back along its seams the way the 41 cruisers had been, because the snuffer's own discharge, denied the planet, had nowhere left to go but back into the fortress that fired it. The Iron Want's masterpiece had killed the Iron Want's heart. The long patience had not had to fire a single shot to end the most powerful object the Concordance possessed. It had only had to stand in the one place where the cruelty could reach nothing but itself. The planet below was untouched. A billion people who would never know how close they had come went on with their afternoon. Across the arm, on 100 way stations and 1,000 tribute worlds, the Concordance's own broadcast carried the moment to every screen the Iron Want had ever installed to keep its subjects afraid. The Empire had wired the whole arm to watch its power. It had never once imagined a day when the whole arm would watch its power turned, at point-blank range, against itself, the masterpiece that snuffed stars discharging into a wall of patient gray light and rebounding into the heart that fired it. Marin learned later that there were worlds where the screens had been left running in public squares for 900 years, a constant reminder of the fleet, and that on the afternoon the Keeper came those squares filled with people who stood and watched in total silence as the thing they had been taught was eternal ate its own hand. No one cheered, on most of those worlds. They had not yet learned that cheering was allowed. They simply watched, and something they had carried in their chests since birth, a held flinch, a permanent bracing against the next blow, began, very slowly, across a whole arm of the galaxy at once, to let go. The Keeper had known the screens were running. That was the thing Marin understood last and held longest. The long patience had let the Iron Sovereign reach for the snuffer, had let it threaten a billion lives, not because it had to, but because it understood that the whole arm was watching on the Empire's own channels, and that the only way to truly end the Count was to let the Count's masterpiece be seen failing by every soul it had ever cowed. It had turned the Empire's surveillance into the instrument of the Empire's unmaking. The Iron Want had spent 900 years making sure everyone saw its strength. The Keeper had simply waited, with terrible patience, for the Empire to point all those cameras at the exact moment its strength came apart. The Iron Sovereign drifted, vast and broken and dark across its forward third, its command tongue gone silent, its bands dead. It was not destroyed. The long patience had been precise about that too. It had let the snuffer unmake exactly as much of the fortress as the fortress had aimed at the world. No more. A debt measured to the gram. The heart of the Iron Want still lived, gutted, drifting, with just enough power left to hear what was said to it next. And the long patience spoke to it, one last time, and the gentleness had come back, which was somehow the most terrible thing of all. You aimed your masterpiece at a billion people who had paid you every cycle of their lives, it said, and we let it find the only thing in this system that deserved it. That is the whole of the lesson, and we are sorry it took so long to teach. The Count was never strength. The snuffer was never strength. They were only ways of being certain no one would ever make you face yourself. We are the thing that came to make you face yourself. We have read you the names of Anvil Loom. We have shown you that your wall runs. We have let your own masterpiece answer for you. The debt of Anvil Loom is paid. We will not take your life, because Anvil Loom would not have taken yours, and we have spent 40 cycles learning to be the kind of people the dead would recognize. You will drift here. Your children will find you. And when they ask what unmade the Iron Sovereign, you will have to tell them the truth, which is that it was your own cruelty, held up to your own face by people who refused to become you. Far out in the dark, the fleeing cruisers had stopped fleeing. They hung at the edges of the system, hundreds of them, the survivors of a wall that had been 11,400 strong and was now a scattered, leaderless thing. They had nowhere to flee to. The concordance was a will, and the will was drifting broken in front of them, and for the first time in 900 years, there was no central voice telling them what they were. The long patience turned its attention to them, and Marin Sewell braced, because this was the moment, surely. This was where the great gray ship that could not be touched would finish the wall it had broken. 11 seconds. It would take 11 seconds. She had seen it. It did not. "You are not the debt," the long patience told the scattered cruisers, in the plain trade tongue, gently. "You never were. You were children handed a weapon and a lie, and the lie has just come apart in front of you, and we know exactly how that feels, because Earth has handed its own children weapons and lies before, and it cost us worlds to learn better. So we are going to give you the thing the Iron Want never gave anyone. We are going to give you a choice with no example attached. Go home. Stand down your collection lanes. Let the tributaries keep this cycle's harvest, and the next, and the one after that, for as long as it takes you to become a people who do not need a wall. We will not weigh you for it. We will not occupy you. We are not here to replace one master with another. We are here, and only here, for Anvil Loom, and Anvil Loom is paid. The arm is yours to remake or to ruin. We will be watching, not to rule you, to remember you. Choose well." There was a thing the keeper did then that Marin did not understand until much later, when the full account of the day had been pieced together from 100 way stations across the arm. Before it turned for the deep, the long patience opened a band, not to the wall and not to the sovereign, but to a single far-off place, a tribute world 11 light-years away on the other side of the garrison's reach, a moon called Serid Pan that no one on Ossuary Vault 9 had any reason to know. And it spoke to that distant moon directly, by name, and the words it sent crossed the void at the speed of light to arrive in 11 years, a message the keeper knew it would not be present to deliver in person. "To the people of Serid Pan," it said, "we have read your file too. We know that your harvest failed last cycle, and that your levy comes due, and that a collection squadron is already on its way to make of you what was made of Anvil Loom. That squadron will arrive before this message does. So this message is not a rescue. We are sorry. We could only be in one place, and we chose to be here, at the heart, where the order came from, because if you cut a wall it grows back, and if you cut a head it does not. By the time you hear these words, the head will already be cut. The squadron that was coming for you will have no sovereign to report to, and no order to enforce, and no example to make, because the thing that made examples is drifting gutted over its own homeworld, and the wall that obeyed it has scattered. You are going to be the next Anvil Loom. You are not going to be. Not because we reached you in time, because we reached the thing that would have killed you in time. Remember that there is a difference, and that sometimes the only mercy a galaxy this large allows is to be early enough to the right place, instead of late again to the wrong one. Keep your harvest. Live to be old. And when you can, learn the names of Anvil Loom, and say them, because that is the whole of the war, and it is a war you can win without a single ship. Marin Sewell, hearing only the half of it that reached her station, did not grasp the scale of what the keeper had just done, that in addition to settling one debt, it had reached out and unmade, by simple arithmetic, the collection of a world it would never see, a world that would go on living entirely because the keeper had chosen the head over the limb. She grasped it years later when a trade barge out of Serid Pan put in at Hessel Drift, and its crew told the story of the cycle the collectors came and then, halfway through their approach, turned in confusion and went home, recalled by a fleet that no longer had a center, and how no one on Serid Pan understood why they had been spared until a message 11 years old finally caught up to them and told them. They had carved the names of Anvil Loom into their own walls before they knew the keeper's name. They had simply known that someone, somewhere, had stood at the heart of the thing and said no, and that the no had reached them across 11 light-years in the only currency that matters, which is a life that gets to go on. And then the impossible thing did the most impossible thing of all. It began to leave. Marin Sewell stood at the glass of the way station and watched the colossal Greykeeper out of Earth turn its prow toward the deep, the open hand on its bow swinging slowly across the stars. and she understood that it was not going to take anything. Not the broken fortress, not the scattered wall, not the tribute world, not the way station, not a single barge of the grain and ore that sat in her docks waiting for a collection that would now never come. A thing 40 kilometers long, powerful enough to unmake the heart of an empire without firing a shot, was going to fold space and go home with empty holds. Overseer Drayle Vant pushed himself up off the rail. He keyed the open band, the one the whole arm could hear, and his voice, when it came, was not the voice of a collection officer anymore. It was the voice of a man who had watched his entire world be proven false in 1 hour and had nothing left to defend. "What were you?" he said. "What kind of empire builds a thing like you and sends it across the galaxy and tells it to leave with nothing?" The long patience paused at the edge of the deep, and when it answered, Marin Sewell felt the words settle into her like the first true thing anyone had ever said to her. "We are not an empire," it said. "Earth tried being an empire, a long time ago, and it nearly cost us everything, and we buried that version of ourselves so deep, we built ships like this, to make sure it stays buried. We are not here to collect. We came 900 years too late for 900,000 people, and we will carry that for as long as we last. And the only thing we could do with the lateness was make certain it would not happen to the next world that could not pay. That is the whole of what we are. We are the people who show up. We are sorry it was not sooner. Remember Anvil Loom. Remember that someone came." But Vant was not finished, and Marin understood why, because he was asking the only question that could still save anything of the man he had been. "How," he said, "how do you build a thing that powerful and not use it the way we would? We had the snuffer for 900 years, and we could not stop ourselves. You have a ship that could empty a galaxy, and you are leaving with nothing. I do not understand how you are possible. I need to understand how you are possible, because if you are possible, then everything I have done was a choice, and not a law, and I cannot bear for it to have been a choice." The long patience was quiet for a moment, hanging at the edge of the deep, and when it answered the way you answer a wound. "It was a choice, Overseer. I am sorry. It was always a choice. That is the worst thing I will tell you today, and the truest, and you are brave to have asked for it. We are not possible, because Earth is wiser than you, or kinder by nature, or made of better stuff. We are possible, because Earth did the thing first. We snuffed our own worlds, long ago, in our own small way, before we ever left our sky. We made our own examples. We counted our own dead and called them necessary. And then we had to live in the galaxy with what we had done, and we found there were only 2 ways to carry it. You can decide the dead deserved it and become the count forever, and that is the road you have been on for 900 years. Or you can decide the dead had names and spend everything you have and everything you build, making sure the next ones do not join them. That is the only difference between us. We chose the second road after the first one nearly ended us. You can choose it now. It is not too late for you the way it was too late for Anvil Loom. The dead are gone, and that cannot be mended, but the road in front of you is still yours. Walk the second one. That is the whole of what we came to tell you. The power was never the point. The power is easy. Anyone can build the snuffer. The hard thing, the thing we crossed the galaxy to show you, is to hold the power in an open hand and choose, every single day, not to close it. We chose it today, in front of you, 11,400 times. Now it is your turn to choose it. We cannot do that part for you. No one can. That is why we are leaving." And the deep folded, and the open hand swung one last time across the crowded stars, and the long patience warped out as slowly and deliberately as it had warped in, more and more of its bulk sliding into the bent place in the dark, until the leading edge was already gone, and only the great gray stern remained, and then the stern, and then nothing, and the stars snapped back to true over Ossuary Vault 9. The tribute clock was still counting. It read 0 now, collection time, and no one came to collect. For a long time after the stars snapped back to true, no one on the deck of Ossuary Vault 9 said anything at all. Marin Sewell stood at the glass and looked at the empty patch of sky where 40 kilometers of patient gray iron had been, And then she looked down at her own hands, which were shaking, and then she looked at the tribute clock reading 0, and at the docks below full of grain and ore that no one was coming to take, and at the scattered, leaderless cruisers of a broken wall hanging silent at the edges of the system, and at the gutted fortress of the Iron Sovereign drifting dark in the middle of it all. She had been a clerk her whole life. She counted things, and she found, standing there, that she did not have a category for any of it. Overseer Drayle Vant was the first to move. He stepped away from the command rail, and he looked at his deck, at the 3,000 tributaries who had spent the hour watching their masters be unmade, and Marin braced again, because this was the part she knew. This was where the concordance reasserted itself. This was where the overseer reminded the dock workers what they were, and the collection resumed, and the world went back to the only shape it had ever held. But Vant did not reassert anything. He stood in the middle of the deck with his collar still half fastened, and he said, to no one in particular, in a small flat voice. It read the names. Sir, the signals clerk began. It read the names, Vant said again. 900,000 of them. From a moon we snuffed 40 cycles ago for a bad harvest. I was a junior officer then. I filed the collection report. I wrote the word example in the margin. He stopped. His hands had begun to shake the way Marin's were shaking. We taught everyone that the Wade have no names, and it stood there in front of the whole arm, and it had every one of them. He sat down on the deck, the overseer of Ossuary Vault 9, in front of his own clerks, and he put his face in his hands, and the certainty that had ruled Marin Sewell's entire life simply ended, quietly, on the floor of a way station, because the man who held it could not carry it anymore. It took the arm a long time to understand what had happened. News moved slowly across the tribute lanes, and the first reports were a confusion of impossibilities. One ship had broken the standing wall. The Iron Sovereign was drifting gutted. The collection lanes had gone silent. For a full cycle, the tributaries of the Iron Want waited, the way a people who have been struck for 900 years waits to be struck again, certain that the silence was a trick, that the collectors would return, that the count would reassert itself the way it always had. The collectors did not return. The scattered cruisers, leaderless, with no central will to tell them what they were, did the thing the long patience had given them room to do. Some of them went home and stood down, exactly as they had been offered. Some of them turned on each other in the confusion, old grudges and ambitions surfacing now that the sovereign was not there to weigh them. But a surprising number of them, more than anyone expected, did a thing the Iron Want had never had a word for. They stayed at their posts, and they stopped collecting, and they waited to see what their tributaries would do when the boot came off. What the tributaries did was remember Anvil Loom. It started small. On Hessel Drift, the moon where Marin Sewell had been born, someone carved the name of the snuffed world into the wall of a grain silo. On a dozen other tribute worlds, the same thing happened, without anyone organizing it, the name appearing on walls and station bulkheads and the hulls of barges, the name of a place none of them had ever seen, the place where a great gray ship had said the collecting stops and made it true. The long patience had taught the arm a single weapon, the one it said the cruel could not answer, and the arm had picked it up. It had taught them to remember out loud. It is hard now to explain to anyone who did not live under the count how enormous a thing this was. The Iron Want had not only taken harvests, it had taken history. A world that paid the levy was permitted to exist, but a world that was made an example of was unmade twice, first its star and then its memory, struck from every record, forbidden in every mouth, until the only proof it had ever lived was the silence where its name should have been. That was the deepest cruelty of the count, deeper than the snuffer, deeper than the wall. It did not merely kill, it erased, so that the killing could go on forever, without anyone learning to be ashamed of it. And the keeper in one afternoon had broken the erasure, not by force but by simply saying the names aloud on the Empire's own bands, where a whole arm could hear, and proving that the silence had been a choice all along, and that any mouth could end it. Once one silo on one moon had a name carved into it, the spell was finished. You cannot re-erase a name that a frightened people has decided to keep. The Concordance had spent 900 years building a machine for forgetting, and the keeper had needed exactly one true sentence, said where it could not be unheard, to break it past all mending. Marin Sewell left the way station 11 days later. There was nothing to count anymore. The barges sat in the docks until their owners, baffled and afraid, and then slowly, cautiously, joyful, came and took their own harvests home. She rowed one of those barges back down to Hessel Drift, and she stood in the silo where someone had carved the name of Anvil Loom into the wall, and she ran her fingers over the letters in the soft round language of a moon she had never seen, and she found that she was crying, and that she did not entirely know why. She thought she understood. Later, she had spent 31 years believing that the shape of the world was the count, and the count was the comfort, and the comfort was that no one ever fights because no one ever wins. And one afternoon a thing had come across the galaxy that did not fight the way the Iron Want fought, did not win the way the Iron Want won, did not take the way the Iron Want took, and in 1 hour it had emptied every one of those certainties out of her like water out of a cracked jar. What was left, when the certainties were gone, was a question she had never been allowed to ask. Not how much do we owe? The other question, the one the long patience had asked the cruisers at the edge of the dark. What would you choose, if no example were attached? It took the arm 40 cycles to answer it. That was a thing the long patience could not have known, and Marin liked to think it would have been glad of it, that the number was the same as the years between the snuffing of Anvil Loom and the day the keeper came. 40 cycles of a slow, stumbling, frightened remaking, the tribute worlds learning to keep their own harvests, the scattered cruisers becoming something that was not a wall, the broken iron sovereign towed to a high orbit over the homeworld and left there, gutted and dark, not as a trophy and not as a grave, but as a thing the children of the Concordance had to sail past every day and explain to their own children. That is the heart of the empire that taught the galaxy the count was strength. This is what came of it. Ask why. Always ask why. The remaking was not clean. Marin never pretended otherwise, not even to herself, not even on the days when the wall of names made it tempting to believe the keeper had simply fixed everything and gone home. It had not. For the first cycle after the keeper left, half the arm waited for the collectors to return, and the other half began, cautiously, to test what no return meant. Some worlds, freed of the levy, did not become gentle. They became greedy in the new way that frightened people become greedy, hoarding harvests against a famine of trust, and a few of the old collection captains, finding no sovereign to obey, set themselves up as small tyrants over single systems, little fists where the great fist had been. The keeper had warned of this. It had said the arm was theirs to remake or to ruin, and it had meant both halves of the sentence, because it had refused, on purpose, to stay and make the choice for them. That was the hardest gift, Marin thought. The keeper could have ruled the arm wisely and kindly for 1,000 years, and no one would have suffered, and it had looked at that future and judged it just another wall, a gentler gauntlet, and it had warped away rather than become it. So the worlds had to learn it themselves, the slow way, the only way that lasts. And what carried them through the ugly middle years, what kept the small tyrants from hardening into a new concordance, was the thing the keeper had left behind that cost it nothing and changed everything: the names. A people who have learned to say the names of the murdered out loud cannot easily go back to making more of them, because the saying of the names is a habit of seeing faces where the old empire had taught them to see only number, and once a people sees faces, they are very hard to rule by the count again. The little tyrants found that their own crews would not snuff a world for them, would not even threaten it, because their own crews had stood on decks like Marin's deck and felt the names written into the place where their fear used to live, and you cannot unfeel that. The keeper had not disarmed the arm. It had done something far more permanent. It had made the weapon useless by making the hands that held it unwilling. Marin met, once, a captain of the old hidden hand, one of the 6,000 who had fired at point-blank range and felt the names come back. He was an old man by then, and he had given his cruiser to a tributary world to use as a grain hauler, and he lived quietly, and read the wall of names when he came through Hessel Drift. She asked him what it had been like, in the shell, firing everything into the gray ship and watching it accomplish nothing. He thought about it for a long time. He said it was not the failing that he remembered. He had expected, somewhere, to fail. He said what he remembered was the moment after, when the keeper had every right to unmake all 6,000 of them, and chose instead to give them back the names, and he understood that he had just tried with his whole strength to kill a thing that, in the same breath, was trying with its whole strength to save him. Not his life, his soul. He said no one had ever tried to save his soul before. He said the Iron Want had 1,000 words for breaking a man, and not one word for that, and he had spent the rest of his life looking for the word, and the closest he had ever come was the open hand on the prow, which he had decided was not a symbol at all but an instruction. Open your hand. See what is in it that is not a weapon. He said the keeper had reached across the whole width of a battle to teach 6,000 killers how to open their hands, and that some of them had, and that he was one, and that it had cost him nothing but his certainty, and had given him back everything the certainty had taken. Draelvant lived long enough to see some of it. He never wore the collar again. He spent the rest of his years on Hesseldrift of all places, on the very moon he had once helped to weigh, and he did one thing with the time he had left. He gathered the names, not just Anvil Loom. Every world the Iron Want had snuffed or starved or broken across 900 years. Every weighed place the concordance had filed under the word example, and he found their names, in the languages of the people who had lived there, and he had them carved, one by one, into the long wall of a quiet hall on the moon of his birth. He said, near the end, that he was not trying to pay the debt. He knew the debt could not be paid. He was only trying to be the kind of person the dead would recognize, the way the great gray ship had said. He had heard it say that, and he had spent 40 years trying to deserve having heard it. Marin Sewell helped him carve the wall. She was good with names. She had counted things her whole life, and it turned out that names were only a different kind of counting, the kind where every number had a face. She grew old doing it. She never married, never left Hesseldrift again, never once regretted it. The wall of names grew until it ran the length of the hall, and turned the corner and ran the length of the next, and people came from across the remade arm to read it, and to add to it, and to ask the question the long patience had taught them to ask. She never saw the great gray ship again. No one in the arm ever did. The long patience had said it would be watching, not to rule but to remember, and Marin chose to believe that it was out there in the deep somewhere, a 40-kilometer keeper sailing under an open hand, showing up wherever some new wall taught some new world that the count was strength. She liked to think it carried the names of Anvil Loom still. She liked to think that someday, on some other way station over some other tribute world, another frightened clerk would look up at an empty patch of sky and watch it fold inward, and watch something impossible and patient and gray slide out of the bent place in the dark, and hear a tired, gentle voice say across every band at once that today the collecting stops. There were rumors over the years. There were always rumors. A trader out of a distant arm spoke of a conquest fleet that had been moving on a cluster of farming worlds and then, without explanation, turned home, its admirals refusing to say why, except that one of them, drunk and frightened, had described an empty sky folding inward and a gray hull with an open hand on its prow that had said only a single sentence and then waited, and that the waiting had been worse than any threat, because the thing had clearly already decided it would win and was simply giving them the time to decide whether they wanted to be alive when it did. Another rumor came from a slaver coast Marin had never heard of, where a tyrant who had ruled by a fear broadcast much like the Iron Wants had woken one morning to find his own broadcast turned against him, carrying not doom but the names of everyone he had ever taken, threaded into the band below hearing so that his own soldiers could not stop weeping, and the tyrant had fled his own fleet, and the fleet had freed itself. Marin could not prove any of it. She did not need to. She knew the shape of it. It was the shape of an open hand. It was the same hand, doing the same thing, in some other dark, to some other count. What she found most beautiful, in her old age, was that the keeper never asked to be thanked, and never came back to see what had grown. It had done a strange and difficult thing on purpose. It had made itself a story rather than a ruler, because a ruler can be killed, and a story cannot, and a ruler must be obeyed, and a story can only be chosen. The Iron Want had ruled by being everywhere. The Long Patience had won by being a story that could be anywhere, carried in the mouths of grain haulers and clerks and old captains who had once tried their hardest to kill it. A story that did the Keeper's work in 10,000 places the Keeper itself would never reach. Marin had counted things her whole life, and she understood at last the arithmetic the Keeper had used, which was the only arithmetic that beats the count. You cannot be in 11,000 places at once. But a story can. A name can. The Keeper had spent one afternoon over one way station, and it had armed an entire arm of the galaxy with the one weapon the cruel can never disarm. And then it had gone, trusting the story to do what 1,000 fleets could not. And the story had. It always did. That was the thing the Count never understood, in 900 years of counting. The weighed have names, and names do not stay weighed. She was an old woman when she finally understood the thing that had frightened her most, that first afternoon, when the Concordance hailed the newcomer and demanded its registry, and the great ship answered with a word no record in the arm had ever held. Earth. She had been terrified then that the file was blank, because the Iron Want had a file on everything that mattered, and a blank file meant the world was bigger and stranger than the Count allowed. She understood, at the end of her life, that the blankness had been the whole of the point. The Long Patience had come out of a nothing the Concordance could not weigh, and it had used the one weapon the cruel could not answer, and it had left with empty holds, and it had asked for nothing in return but that a broken people learn to remember out loud. It had been bigger than the Count. It had always been bigger than the Count. That was what an open hand meant. On the day she died, Marin Sewell asked to be carried into the Hall of Names one last time. They set her chair before the long wall, and she looked at the rows and rows of carved names running the length of the hall, and around the corner, and out of sight, the murdered worlds of 900 years, each one a face, each one a number that had been given back its name, and she found that her jaw had come open the way it had come open that first afternoon at the glass. Not in fear this time, but in something she finally had a word for, a word the Iron Want had never taught her, and the great gray ship had brought across the galaxy, and left behind in the silos, and the bulkheads, and the long carved wall. Wonder. She died looking at the names. The hall is still there, the arm still reads them, and somewhere out in the deep, under an open hand, the Keeper still sails, and the collecting, in the places it has reached, has stopped, and the people it freed do not bow before they can walk anymore. They remember, out loud, the way they were taught by the colossal gray ship that warped in over a tribute world one ordinary afternoon, and dropped the jaw of an entire empire, and asked for nothing, and left only a question and a wall of names and the one true thing the cruel can never take. That someone came.